So we are in the geometric period, and this dates to between 900 and 700 BCE. And this is coming out of those dark ages that I talked about last time. So if you remember last time, there was that period where the Greeks forget how to write, and they kind of go into those settlements up in the hills to kind of escape whatever was going down by the sea. So this is a time of reinvention and rebirth, and it's a very exciting period. And we know that more people are living. We know that more people are living because we have more graves, therefore more people are dying, and so we know that the population is rising at this time. However, that causes a great strain on their resources. I don't know if you guys remember last week when I talked about, or gosh, was it last? Yeah, last week I talked about how Greece's terrain and geographically it wasn't really the best for like growing food, and so it does put a huge strain on their food sources. The polis develops, and this is the combination of having the city core with the community around it, and each one of these communities around it is going to help support that city core, and it's going to have its own government. And for example, Athens and Attica combined are going to create a polis, and so like Sparta, and then around Sparta, each one of these has its own government, and this is a polis. Now, however, Greece is unified by language and by culture and by religion, so there's a lot of things that keep them united. There's a lot of pressure on food, demands for food, and this kind of creates a little bit of a political tension, and to alleviate this stress, the Greeks resort to colonization. So this is a time of colonization. They colonize in Italy, Sicily, Spain, France, edge of the Black Sea. They go all over and they're colonizing. So they're sending out colonies of people basically because they didn't really have enough resources at home to support them. Now, the Greeks were sailing in slightly flimsier ships, and they would sail during the day, and they would have to anchor at night, and they were only sailing around the coast, and they stayed near the coast. And they were kind of essentially traveling blind. They really weren't exactly sure where they were heading, and colonists consult the gods in order to, before embarking, they would go to Delphi, and I talked about Delphi, I mentioned it last time. And the god Apollo had a shrine there, and at this particular spot there was an oracle, and you could go and kind of consult this oracular priestess and ask about the future. Is this a good idea? Should I or should I not colonize? And it would kind of give these people divine permission to colonize. So the oracle is going to like go under the influence of all these gases or whatever's around. She'll come up with an answer, and that would give them an answer of maybe if they should head east or if they should head west or which direction. And this also keeps them united. All Greeks go to Delphi, so it's not just one polis. Delphi really isn't even a polis. It's really just a sanctuary that these Greeks would go to in order to figure out what their next step was. So the Greeks go out and they colonize, and in 776 BCE is the very first Olympic Games, so that's during this geometric period. And that's a time when Greeks can come back to the mainland, come back to Olympia, and they could celebrate their Greekness, what made them Greek, and you had to speak it. So anyone from anywhere in the colonies could come back and participate in these games, and this was a way that they could come back and really celebrate being Greek. And we're going to see, it's really important. Greeks really have, they have a lot of importance on these sports and games and that sort of thing. The other thing that we see at this time is that they take the alphabet that's created by the Phoenicians and they adopt the alphabet. Of course, they adapt it to their own language, so they begin writing again. And if you remember, they had been writing in Linear B during Mycenaean times. They fell out of disuse. They no longer were literate, basically, and they had quit writing, and now they're writing again. And they've adopted this Phoenician alphabet around 800 BCE, and they write down, the Iliad is written, the Odyssey, it's written down, and these are these epic poems that we've all heard about, studied, and read, that had been passed down orally for some time, are now being written. But this also unites all Greeks, because all Greeks have read it, know the stories, and that's kind of part of being Greek for them as well. Okay, so we're going to look at, this is, temples begin to appear. They're basically these very basic structures. Now, sanctuaries are sacred land, so it doesn't really matter a sanctuary is not a building, and I think that we think of that as a building. When I say sanctuary, it kind of sounds like I'm talking about a building, but a sanctuary is anything, a sacred piece of land. And I think I mentioned that the island of Delos is one of those. The whole island is actually a sanctuary. So this is at Dreros, and the sanctuary. Okay, this is the one I want to look at here. So Dreros begins as a very simple temple or shrine at this sanctuary, and it's a bench temple, which basically means in the back of it, so you would walk in, and in the back there'd be like a little bench, and on that bench you could go and you could leave whatever offerings you wanted to leave to the gods. There was a fire pit, and the fire pit would be here, and then there would be the smoke would exit. This is the superstructure's all made out of mud brick, so it's something that hasn't lasted over time. So this is one of our very first types of temple structures, and we call these bench temples. This one's quite narrow. It's only 11 meters by 7 meters, and you would enter through that small porch there, and it's got 2 wooden columns. And this was a place of worship, sacrifice, because you would sacrifice animals, usually cows. And when you sacrifice cows, everyone could feast and eat off of it. So a sacrifice time was a really great time as well, because then people could come back and eat, have a good meal. This was repeated over and over. We're going to look at another place. On the left, I have the Temple of Hera at Samos. And this is off the coast of Turkey. And this is 100 feet long. It had a stone foundation, and the superstructure was again in mud brick with a thatched roof, so it's not something that's lasted. There was a wooden colonnade down the interior, and you can see that. Now the sanctuary is this whole area. This is the temple part, and the altar has now been moved outside. So already we see a difference. From Dreros over here to Samos, the area of the sacrificing of the animals is now moved to the east. It's outside at an altar that's separate from the actual temple. And the interior of this temple has this colonnade, and there's still at the back, the cult statue would have been here. This would have been the focus of worship. There would have been a cult statue there of Hera that would have been on the interior. So this is the temple dedicated to Hera at Samos that comes a little bit later. This is around 800, that's around 700. And we see a peristyle has been added. So like the next phase in temple, the evolution of the temple, is to have a peristyle. And a peristyle is a colonnade that goes around the entire perimeter of the structure, and that's what a peristyle is. So we're going to come back to this temple plan a little bit later on after we've looked at some pottery and see some further developments. But this is kind of the beginning of what will become a standard Greek temple. Okay. So pottery, before this, we're in the geometric period. In the proto-geometric period was very kind of clumsy with concentric circles, and we didn't see images of humans, but we do here. This dates to around 900 BCE, and we see that linear decoration is in these registers. So we still have registers, and you guys remember registers from the chapter, I think we saw it in chapter 2, but we've got registers, these bands that are dividing the composition into these separate bands. And we see a lot of meanders, zigzags, cross-hatching. Let me get an up close here of this. This is a funerary crater, and this crater would have been used as a grave marker. Mourners would pour libations into the crater, and then the wine would like seep down into the ground and then hopefully into the body below, and that's kind of what it was used for. So it was a grave marker that you could pour libations, and libations are liquid offerings, and I've used that word before, so you should know it. It's made from terracotta and on a potter's wheel in different sections, and then it was joined together. So let's just look at what we see. So we see the deceased here on this funerary bier, and we also see his family around him. We see mourners on the side, and they've got their hands over their head. They're pulling out their hair. They're very upset. They're mourning. And the animals, there's actually animals below, and these could have very well been the animals that would have been sacrificed. And below, we have a procession of warriors in chariots. Their armor kind of melds with their body. It's hard to separate armor from body as we're even looking at this. What is the difference between this and what we saw, for example, in Egypt as far as death and funerary practices?
discernible figure that you know is a deity? They all very much look similar.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah. What else? Yeah, go ahead.
It says in the book that it's kind of depicting the relatively new Greek practice of cremation, and that wasn't an Egyptian ritual. That wasn't part of the ritual.
Very true, yeah. They did inhumation, they mummified, sure. One of the big focuses here in the art is on those who are still alive. It's on the mourning. The concern is not with the deceased. So in Egypt, if you notice, it was always about what was going to happen to the deceased in the afterlife. It was leading the deceased into the next world, and it was about the person who had died. We notice here that it's actually the deceased it's like the deceased is just lying up here on this figure. The rest of it is about the mourners and the people that are still living. So the focus is not so much on the afterlife, and we won't see that in Greek art. We're not going to see art that deals with the afterlife like we saw in Egypt. We're going to see the people that are left behind, and it's going to deal more with that. Okay, so this is another vase, dates around 750 BCE, I think actually might be a little bit earlier. And this we have something that we're not even really sure of. We see fish, we see this man floating it, he's in the water. I'm going to pull up another image that shows the reconstruction. And so looking at this, we can see that there is, over here, let's see, we've got the ship here, we've got fish, we've got human figures, and then we've got a figure being eaten by a fish. And so we always wonder, looking at this, we don't have anything written about it, but what we do know is that they're showing them at sea. Are they showing something historical? Are they showing something that's mythical? We still don't know. So we don't know if this is something historically that happened, if someone went back and painted, his uncle that got lost at sea, or the one survivor, or if it's showing something mythical. And I just like this example because I think it's really funny. We got this fish with this guy, his head's in it. That's not funny to him. This is an ivory figurine, and the ivory must have come from Syria or Africa because there's no ivory, there's no elephants in Greece. And it shows, very interestingly, it actually shows one woman who is basically half nude. This is the way Syrians showed at this time nude females, but this is not typical of Greek females. Greek females will almost always be dressed up until, they will always be dressed up until the late classical period. And so this is showing the kind of the trade. We've got ivory from somewhere else, and we're showing a different artistic way of showing females that's not Greek. So this is showing their trade, and they could relate to Dionysus because only the females that relate to Dionysus at this time would have ever been shown with less clothing than normal. Okay, now we're going to the Orientalizing period. Okay, actually, I'm going to skip this one. At this time, in the Orientalizing period, which dates from around 700 to 600 BCE, it's a time when Greeks are under the influence of the East, and that's why we call it the Orientalizing period. And it's a term that developed in the 19th century, so it's something that, of course, they didn't refer to themselves as under the Orientalizing period, but this is an influence of the East because they're traveling a lot and a lot of changes. Okay, so colonization is increasing rapidly at this time. Some colonies are even sending out colonies, so we've got colonies that have grown so much that they can even send out colonies. And there's a larger network of Greek communities. And there's also a very important colony in Egypt, Naucratis, which we'll talk about later. Industries begin to expand in Greece. We've got olive oil production, metallurgy, pottery develops, shipbuilding, because they're sending out lots of ships and colonies. They've got a lot of shipbuilding as well. These industries are bringing wealth to a broader sector of the population. So before the polis is run by the rich were the people who had the land. But now, if you owned a shipbuilding company and you may not own a lot of land and you now are getting a lot of money from your shipbuilding company, you're becoming rich. So there's kind of that tension between kind of the old money, the ones who were the landowners, and now the new money because there's so much production. So there's a little bit of tension here even between politically. And we also see the beginnings of a very faint democracy, not quite yet. Most cities are being led by oligarchies, which just means ruled by a few. Another thing that we see that develops during this time is warfare, which had been chariot-based. We now see cavalry-based, which is going to allow a lot more people to be in the military in any sense, because owning a horse was very expensive. Buying a shield and a breastplate was less expensive. So if you wanted to be in the military before, you'd have to have the money to have like your chariot and horses. Now you just need to be able to be a foot soldier. So this is allowing more people to enter into the infantry. So we see the rise of the infantry at this time as well. Okay. We also see, or we do believe, that the development of the Doric and Ionic orders, because the temples in the Orientalizing period we still don't have made out of stone. We don't have their wooden structures left over, but we do believe it's when the Doric and Ionic orders arise. And we do not have, like I said, the physical remains of these, but we know that they were made out of wood, and we have evidence when we have our first stone temples at the beginning of the Archaic period. They seem to be direct translations of their wooden predecessors. Okay? So the Doric and the Ionic columns are developing at this time. Okay, so the rise of the Ionic and Doric orders. This is what I'm talking about. The Doric right here, the Ionic right here. The Doric order is going to have a thicker column, thicker fluted column. The capital will be made of the Anchinas and the Abacus, and that's the capital here. The Doric, if you can tell, has volutes, and that's the difference there as far as the capital goes. The Doric order sits directly here on the stylobate, whereas the Ionic order is going to have a little bit of a base that's on the stylobate. And then one of our big differences, we're going to be looking at the sculptural programs once we get into the Archaic period of each of these temples. And the sculptural program for a Doric temple is going to be in the metopes and in the pediments. And this frieze here goes triglyph, metope, triglyph, metope. It's a repeating pattern, and that's for the Doric order. Whereas the frieze for an Ionic temple is going to be continuous frieze, and there'll be sculpture here. You guys are going, where's the sculpture? We'll see it. So these are the differences between the Doric and Ionic orders. There's other more refined differences and such, but those are the main ones. And we'll be looking at the sculptural programs within both these kinds of temples. But it's important to know that Doric has metopes, triglyphs, and metopes, and then our Ionic's going to have a continuous frieze. So there's some differences. So this is a time when we see the rise of these orders. So I'm going to pull this back up. So we return again to the temple of Hera at Samos. And this now dates to around 650 BCE, and we can see a big difference. So this is the same site that we looked at before that originally had a colonnade running down the middle. Do you guys remember that? And now it's been removed. And it didn't have a peristyle at the beginning, and now it does. So we have our peristyle like we had in the last one, but we have eliminated, the Greeks have now eliminated the colonnade that's running down the center, which is also going to help because when you walk in, you're not going to be looking down this colonnade because down here is the cult statue. And so this is going to, when you walk in, you're in a cella and your view is not obstructed and you can see right down until the very end. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that columns are going to be oriented east-west. The door is going to open to the east to the rising sun. That's something that starts actually way back at Dreros. So that's something that was kind of at the beginning of temple. Even actually, if you go all the way back to the end of our last lecture at Lef Kandi, that place of the hero, the Heron, that was actually an east-west orientation. It actually starts as far back as that. And we'll find that even Christian churches are east-west oriented. So these develop into temples. Rome will do the same thing, and actually even churches will end up being east-west. So it's very easy to remember. And the east because they open to the rising sun. There are very few examples. There are some temples that open up to the west, but those will be dedicated to like Artemis or someone of the underworld, and that's when we'll see those. Okay. And these are on in sanctuaries that there wouldn't be just the temple. There would be a stoa that might have had other functions. So the temple is just one part of a sanctuary. Okay. Oh, and I didn't mention this, but when we were looking back at that temple of Hera, there was a pit found outside of it where people are bringing offerings. And so you would find whatever was precious to you. And some would leave metal, some would leave very precious and expensive items. Some would find a piece of coral that was beautiful or a beautiful shell that they might have found in the sea, and they would offer that to the gods. When when the offering, like I don't say offering plate, but when all these offerings accumulated and they had no place to put it, you couldn't really take back a gift that you'd given to the gods. So a large pit was dug, and then all these offerings were then placed in like a pit, and then they kind of start fresh. But what's very interesting is that people left what was valuable to them. So if you were rich and you could leave something that was made out of metal, you would. If you didn't have a lot of money, but you had something that was precious to you, like a beautiful stone or a beautiful shell, that's what you would leave. So people gave what was valuable to them in order to gain favor with the gods. Okay, so now we're going to go to sculpture. This is the Lady of Oxyr, dates to 440 BCE. It's made of limestone, 2 feet tall, and she's got her feet together, she's facing forward, and we see some similarities between her and our Egyptian statues, because Egyptians had the same kind. They had stiff, human figures, with hair that was stylized like we have here, almost like a wig. Now, some differences are where her body is much more clothed. It seems like there was a sense of the female figure a little bit more in the Egyptian world when we looked at their statues. She's wearing very heavy clothing. If you were to actually get up close, you can see, maybe I can even zoom in a little bit, you can actually see that there's etching on her gown to even show that it was cloth, and there's like a design there, and you can kind of see that. And she would have been completely painted. That's something else, is she looks very plain to us now. She would have been very garishly painted in antiquity. Yeah.
I remember our mythology class, and we talked about a German archaeologist who discovered that a lot of Pantheon and later Greek statues with the obsidian that's white had many pigments and colors in them that we didn't notice until late.
Oh, really? Yeah, these were all painted. Actually, everything that we see was painted. And I think that some of the recreations of the way they were painted is almost a little too intense, and it's kind of like, why would you paint it like that? She was painted very garishly, and you can actually look online and see the way she would have been painted, because she's at the Louvre Museum now, and they've kind of reconstructed what she would have looked like painted. She does not come with an inscription, so we don't know exactly her meaning, but we can look at this next statue from the island of Delos, which I've mentioned before, in the middle of the Cyclades. And it's not a very good representation of what, obviously it's kind of in bad repair. She's not looking at her best here. But there is an inscription, which I'm going to read to you, and it says, Nicandre dedicated me to Artemis, the far shooter of arrows. Nicandre, who is the excellent daughter of Diadochus of Naxos, the sister of Diomedes, and wife of Phraxus. So this is giving us information about what she was intended for, her intended use. We're learning that she's a dedication to Artemis, so she's an offering. She is also telling us who the donor is in relationship to the men in her life. And that's something in the Greek world, is that the women really didn't have a very strong role. They were always in relationship to a man. And so it gives us the name of her father, her brother, and her husband. But we don't know the name. We do know Nicandre dedicated her, but we don't have a sense of who she is. We just know who she is in relationship to the men in her life. And she's dedicated to Artemis. The other thing is that this statue is speaking in the first person. It's saying, Nicandre dedicated me. And that the inscriptions that we found are all speaking in the first person. These statues are speaking in the first person. This was life-size. She's taller than me, actually. She's 5'9", so she's quite tall. And this is called the Daedalic style. So the style at this time is called the Daedalic style, and it's also all the shapes are very, even though we're not in the geometric period, there's a lot of geometric shapes to her body, and it's not in any way trying to show off the female form, but represent the female form. Does that make sense? Okay. This is a very small bronze statue from Thebes. It's also in the Daedalic style here. And the only thing that this man has on is a belt. He's nude otherwise. And that's also going to be what we see in Greek art. The men are going to be nude and the females are going to be dressed. And slowly, leading up to the late classical period, the women will kind of begin to show more skin. But for now, men are always nude, women are always clothed. And this also has an inscription. It says, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Mantilos offers me as a gift to Apollo of the silver bow, so now you, Apollo, give some pleasing thing in return. So this, again, is speaking in the first person. But we learn something else. Not only is it an offering and dedicated to Apollo, but it says, give some pleasing thing in return. So it's given with the hope that the offerer will receive something as well. So these kind of let us know why these were created. Both of these inscriptions help us understand the reason for these offerings, these votive statues. Okay, so vase painting is another. In this chapter, we're going to be looking mostly at temple construction, so architecture, temple construction, sculpture, and vase painting. Those are kind of the three medium that we're going to be looking at in this chapter. So vase painting develops from Corinth. Corinth had control of two different harbors, one going east, one going west, so their pottery gets dispersed widely. They are also able to send a lot of the trends. They were the great trendsetter, shall we say, of this time period as well. So from early times, Greeks knew that vases are going to be the color. Each clay and each piece of earth clay can be in different colors. So there's red clay, and when we see a red piece of pottery from red clay, it's usually from the area of Athens, and then the clay around Corinth is more of a goldish color. So clay is used for its color, and then what you could do, and I think I explained what slip is if you take a clay and you muddy it or water it down and it becomes almost like a liquid, almost like a paint, then you could use that to paint on top of an already fired vessel. So that slip is really just, and didn't I explain this already? Yeah. Okay, I did. All right, just making sure because I always forget. I always feel like I'm having deja vu. I'm like, I said this. Okay, so slip is being used here in the geometric period, and it was used before, or we're now in the Orientalized period, but it was also used before when we saw those mourners in the geometric period. So this is just using slip. And then in Corinth, the technology is taken further. And they're not just using slip like they had been in the geometric period, but now in the Orientalizing period, the Corinthians realized that if you incise lines of slip before it was fired, you would have the background color underneath, and that could show more detail. Okay, so that's what they've done to show the details. They've incised it, which is just basically cutting it so that you're able to get those details that we can see, for example, on the right-hand side. It's a Corinthian. This is called the Chigi vase, and it's a Corinthian. Chigi vase? I just said it backwards. Chigi vase. Chigi vase. And it dates to around 650, and it's small. It's only about 6 inches tall. So that's small. There's another one that's actually only 3 inches tall. And it's really the exploration of what they can do. I mean, that's technology. Who needs a 3-inch vase, right? I mean, you're not going to spend that much time on something that small, but it's really technologically what can they do. And here's an up close of the hunting scene, so we can see those details that they've used with the incised lines. Okay. All right, this is from the area of Attica. And this is from the cemetery of Eleusis. If anyone has their outline, that's what I'm talking about. It states 660 BCE. It's an amphora. Usually these would hold liquids, but this was very large. It was 3 feet tall, so larger than most. The other one was 6 inches. This was 3 feet. And actually, this is not the whole view. I think, let's see if I've got it. I'm just showing you the neck here. I think I've got, okay, so here's the whole thing, and then this is the up close of just the neck of it. And this, usually these are used as grave markers, but this was actually used as a sarcophagus. It was large enough for a small boy to be in there. So this shows a scene from mythology on the top of this neck, and it actually shows the blinding of Polyphemus, and that's something that all Greeks would have recognized. It was when Odysseus was kind of trapped inside with his men inside of a cave with this Cyclops Polyphemus. And then they find some grapes. I don't know how they're able to ferment it and turn it into wine so quickly, but they do. They get Polyphemus drunk, and they're able to blind him. And this is the blinding of Polyphemus. So this is a story that Greeks would have known. They would have looked at this and recognized it. And even in the words of Homer, it talks about the sizzling, because they took they put their little poker in a fire, and with this hot stick, they sizzled his eye out. I don't know if you can tell, but the Corinthian, that one that we were just looking at, the Corinthians were better. They were just the better at pottery at this time. The details are better. The painting is better. This is from the area of Athens. That's not always going to be saying that Athens kind of gets better, but there's a lot of even rivalry between Athens and Corinth. Okay, so during the Orientalizing period, I'm going to go to this next one while I sum up what we see in the Orientalizing period. This is an olpe, it's a picture from Corinth, and there's one similar in your book. It's not quite the same, but we see the use of this this is called black figure technique, but we also see a white and red slit being used with incising to kind of make it polychrome, and that's what Corinthians do best. So during this period, during the Orientalizing period, law codes are being published, which I don't think I mentioned. We see a lot more trade, enhanced trade, and influence from the East. And we also see the development and architecture of the Ionic and Doric orders and how a temple should function. So that's kind of a summary of what we see during this Orientalizing period. And now we're going to go to the Archaic period. So the Archaic period dates from 600 to 480 BCE, about. Let's see, where are we going with this? And Athens dominates the arts and even the history of this period. Athens managed to kind of maintain an oligarchic government, while during the Orientalizing period there was a lot of polis that fell under the rule of the tyrants. And I'm not going to go through the whole history, but it's during the 6th century that Athens is kind of breaking free and moving towards a democracy. So that's also important politically at this time. Now, in Asia Minor, which would be the west coast of Turkey, there are a lot of Greeks that are living there. And in 560 BCE, the Lydian king Croesus, he began conquering the Greeks in Asia Minor. However, he was very tolerant and liked the Greeks, so he wasn't ruling tyrannically at all, but he was very supportive of Greek society. And in 546 BCE, King Croesus, he was conquered by the Persians. It's kind of a sad story. Yeah?
So the image on the right, that would be Doric order?
Yeah. You got it. In 546, King Croesus is, like I said, conquered by the Persians. He'd actually gone to an oracle, and he had asked, am I going to win against the Persians? And the message of the oracle was, one great empire will fall. And of course, he's like, oh, great, the Persians are falling. But it wasn't the Persians, it was himself. Bummer. And the Greeks then now, the ones living in Asia Minor, are now going to be under Persian control because King Croesus just fell under the Persians. So the Greeks in Asia Minor are not very happy about this. And that's the area that we call Ionia, that west coast of Turkey, and that's where we also get the word for the Ionic order, because that's where the Ionic order develops in the east, whereas the Doric order develops in the west. And in 499 is an Ionian revolt. And the Greeks in Asia Minor, they revolt against the Persians. They ask Sparta for help, and Sparta refuses, and then they ask Athens for help, and Athens actually sends ships to their aid. And this keeps the Persians away for 5 years, and 5 years later the Persians reconquer Asia Minor, and then they are very aware that the Athenians had helped the Ionians 5 years previously and come for Athens. So a Persian fleet of about 20,000 landed at the Bay of Marathon, which is 20 miles east of Athens. The Athenians ask for help from Sparta. Sparta refuses, so the Athenians have to stand alone against the Persians. And they were outnumbered 2-1. To everyone's surprise, Athenians and Persians alike, everyone was surprised to find that Athenians were victorious. I like this story because it really reminds me of the beginning of American history. I love, like, when I think about the Revolutionary War. We were going up against England, the greatest nation at that time for as far as war goes and as military goes, and we won. And it's really that same moral in both these stories, is that when you're fighting as free people for your land, you're going to fight harder than if you're outnumbered 2-1. You're going to fight better, you're going to fight harder. And so the Athenians even attributed the fact that they won the fact that they were free men and they were free democratic citizens, and they were going against a regime that they were even anti. They were this totalitarian regime that was against everything that they believed in, and they were victorious. So they believed in the excellence of their hoplite warfare, and this also set a pattern as far as Athens being the protector of Greece. In 10 years later, the Persians return. Sparta helps this time, but they were unfortunately defeated at Thermopylae, which I think is that what 300's based off of, that movie? Maybe. The Persians then come to Athens. They burn all the buildings on the Acropolis, and then soon after that, the Greeks do end up defeating the Persians at Salamis. And I think that's what the sequel is. It's one of those sea battles, or it's one of those, I think it might be that. I'm not sure. Anyway, the Acropolis is then just like demolished. It was just destroyed, and that's going to kind of come back to haunt the Athenians. They're going to remember that. So the impact of these wars just really stays in the imagination of the Greeks for the next very long time, years and years, hundreds of years to come. So that's the background to what we're looking at in the Archaic period. That's kind of the time period that we're talking about. Okay, so we're going to look in the Archaic period. We see our first full-scale cut stone buildings. So up until now, we've seen buildings with stone foundations, but then a mud brick superstructure, wooden columns, and that sort. Now we see true full-scale cut stone buildings, and they're getting this idea and maybe even technology from Egypt, because I said they'd had a colony there. They've had a colony there for like 200 years, and they've been looking at the stone buildings that the Egyptians have been building. They don't come back and build anything that's Egyptian. They actually translate what they had in wood and in mud brick. They translate that into stone. Even though the orders had already been established, we now have it for the first time in stone. I'm going to give you the words, because there's so many. If anyone's printed off your vocabulary from this chapter, it's really long, and I just took the one that the publisher sends out. But the words that you do want to know, certain words. You don't have to memorize everything on that list, but the stylobate, which is that upper step, this is your stylobate. You need to know that word. And you're going to want to know the different parts inside of the temple, which I can't remember what page that's on, but you'll want to know the pronaos, which is that front porch that's opening up to the east, the cella, which is the main part of your temple, your main room where the cult statue would have been, the apostatamos, which is that smaller room on the west side, and that would have been where the gifts would have been stored, those offerings to the gods would have been stored, and the peristyle is that colonnade going around. And then we will be talking about pediments, triglyphs, and metaphyses and friezes. So as far as the temple vocabulary, that's probably what you're going to want to know. I know that there's more in your book, but I just gave you the short list. The basic plan doesn't really change for the next, this is just the way the Greeks are going to build their temples from now on out. And we see that the Doric order is kind of canonized here, and in the difference between them, if you look at this Doric, they're a little bit more cumbersome, a little bit more thick. The Ionic orders are a little bit more slender, and we'll kind of be looking at some of the differences as we go through this. This is not my favorite image. That one that I showed you earlier was better, but you can see here, don't pay attention to the Romans, that we've got our Greek Doric and then our Greek Ionic. Corinthian doesn't come into play until the late classical period. Okay, so this is the Athenian treasury at Delphi, and it would have been a place to store gifts to the god Apollo. This is a treasury. It's actually not a temple, but it still has the Doric columns, and it has the triglyphs and the metopes above. And they built this in celebration to the victory that the Athenians had at Marathon, and so this is built kind of in celebration of that. Treasuries could be locked up. They looked like little temples, and inside they would hold a vast treasure of offerings to the gods. And this one is at Delphi. And at Delphi, there's a whole bunch of different treasuries from all the different polis that wanted to, because Delphi was the place where the oracle service was to Apollo. And so Greeks from all over the Greek world are going to go here. And each city is going to have its own little treasury where you could go and make an offering. And that's what we see here. And we see these Doric columns. Up above, we see the triglyphs. The metopes, we can't see the sculpture in it, but because most of it's fallen down, but you can see the remnants of the sculpture up there as well. Okay, this is the temple dedicated to Hera at Samos. This is, I think, the last time I show it because I keep revisiting that same temple because now it's being rebuilt. The temple was rebuilt yet again, now in stone, because before we'd seen it in mud brick and when it had a thatched roof, but now we've got it in stone, and it's built on a massive scale. And we noticed that it has actually, it's a dipteral. Dipteral has 2 peristyles going around. And this is really, we call this even a forest of columns. So when you walk up, the effect is great. You see all these columns, lots and lots and lots of columns. And this is typical in the east. This is typical in the area of Ionia. Ionic ordered columns are going to have this, and the Temple of Hera here is in the Ionic order, and it is in the east at Samos, which is an island off of Asia Minor, just a little bit off the coast. Let's see the next. I think I give you another example. Oh, here's just the Ionic order. So here's the column capital. And then here's the floor plan for Ephesus. So very similar. We've got a dipteral. It's also in the Ionic order. This double peristyle going around. I did want to show you that this is a reconstruction of these columns here. See how tall they are? And at the bottom, these actually had relief sculpture. This temple, there's like nothing left. When I went there, you see like a column in a pond with a turtle. I remember the turtle. So we're going to go to archaic sculpture of sculpture in the round. This is a koros, and koros just means boy. That's all it means. And so if you remember, they had contact with Egyptians, and also this is going to influence their sculpture here in Greece. And there was 2 dominant kinds of these sculptures. There's the koros and the kore, the boy and the girl, and that's kind of what we call them. We call them the koros and the kore. Made of marble, they're life-size, sometimes even larger than life-size. And the male is always naked, and the female is always dressed. On page 114 in your book, it offers ideas as to why these were created, and that they might represent gods, they might represent priestesses, athletes, warriors. There's kind of a whole list in your book that talks about it. They could have also been grave markers as well. I'm going to go to put 2 of these up next to each other. So on the left-hand side, we have the New York Koros dating to 600 BCE. It's in your book. And we see, much like that Egyptian, so if you remember the Egyptian with 1 foot forward, weight evenly distributed on the 2 feet with 1 foot forward, so it kind of reminds us of that Egyptian that we saw when we looked at Menkaure. And he's got stylized hair, very rigid beard-like pattern, and his ear looks more like volutes than ears if we look up close. On the right-hand side, we have the Anavisos Koros that dates to about 525 BCE, and it comes from a tomb on Attica in Navisos. And he actually stood as a grave marker, and his name, it has an inscription as Crasius. And his head is now more proportioned with his body. So if we just look at both of these together, and they're separated here by 50 years or so, or maybe a little bit more. On the right-hand side, the Navisos Kouros already has more realistic volume. It has been rendered a little bit more lifelike than our New York Kouros on the left-hand side. And we see that there have been changes that they still don't look, our Navisos still doesn't look completely like a normal male, but we already see the evolution from this to this. There is more lifelikeness. This has more realistic volume. His head is not in proportion to his head, but 70 or so years later, the right-hand side he is. So we already see differences just in a short amount of time that the Greeks are making to try to create something more lifelike, something that looks more like a human, which you remember the Greeks didn't, or the Egyptians didn't do. The Egyptians didn't care about that. Do you remember the Egyptians just stuck to their canon? They just stuck to the way, this is the way it looks, and it stays that way for 2,000 years. The Greeks don't do that. They're going to constantly be changing the way that human figures are depicted. Like every 50, 60 years, they're going to evolve and change until they come up with the perfect human, and they do. Remember that all these statues were also painted. Don't ever forget that. They are all painted. I'm just giving you another example here. This is of the calf bearer, and he's taking a calf to be sacrificed up on the Athenian Acropolis. I think I've got another one, just another example. They all have this really creepy, archaic smile. Has everyone noticed they all have the exact same expression? It's this one. It's kind of spooky. That's the expression I give when I want to freak out my sister. And she's like, that's so creepy. It's the archaic smile. And that's what it's actually called. It's called the archaic smile. And it's very not realistic and creepy. So here's two different, the one on the right-hand side is a horseman. He's also from the Athenian Acropolis. So now we're going to look at female figures. This is, on the left-hand side is the Berlin Kore from the cemetery near Athens, and she was found intentionally buried as someone tried to protect her, or maybe before the Persians came, she had been buried. She has very large, heavy drapery, a very typical stance, one hand with an offering, a very kind of elaborate costume. You actually can see some of the leftover paint on both of these. If you look close at both of them, there's a little bit of leftover paint. She was used as a funerary monument. She's more than 6 feet tall, so she's even larger than life size. And she has probably a pomegranate, a symbol of Persephone, in her hand. She's labeled. It says, "This is the grave marker of Phrasyclea. I shall always be called a Kore. The gods giving this title instead of marriage, Aristion of Paros made me." So she tells us what she's used for, and she's speaking in the first, she's telling us what, in the first person, I shall always be called Kore, so she's speaking again in the first person. And it also is the name of the artist, which is interesting because we're going to see that through the Greek world, slowly the name of an artist is going to become more important. So she must have been a girl, never married, it says that she was never married, that came from a fairly good family to afford a good artist, because if the artist signed it, he must have been important. So the girl died before she got married, and on the right-hand side, we've got what's called the Peplos Kore, and this is dates around 530 BCE, so a little bit newer. Yes, she's new. And she's a little bit slimmer than the Berlin Kore. She has the same archaic smile as the other figures we've seen with this kind of just lippy smile. Very simple costume, and again, it would have been brightly painted. But can you see the difference already between one and the other? In a short amount of time, in a 40-year difference, we've got this extremely heavy, almost cumbersome female, and on the right-hand side, we've got a little bit more slender, gentle. She's actually called La Delicata in Italy, which just means that she's kind of delicate. And so we can already see the developments in a short period between these female figures as well. So in 480 BCE, the Persians attacked Athens, and so many of these statues on the Acropolis were up there. Some of them have been recovered. A lot of them have been broken. And there was a pit that was uncovered with a lot of pieces of these statues, and that's where we found a lot of these. Here there's an up close, so you can actually see some of that paint left over on her eyes and her hair. Okay, I'm not worried about looking at the plan of this, but you can actually look at it yourself where you can see the peristyle. It opens to the east. Over here's the altar, so the sanctuary's got the altar here. You would walk up into the temple. You've got your pronaos, your cella, your apostatamos. This is a really nice typical Greek plan, and this is the temple dedicated to Artemis at Corfu. Okay. So the Temple of Corfu on the right-hand side dates to 580 BCE. 50 years later is this Siphnian treasury on the left-hand side. And what I want you to get out of this, you don't have to remember so much, you know, the different sculpture on it. Here we have Medusa with her children, and then on the sides there's this animalesque creature, and then there's the death of Priam in one of these pedimental. You can see how this is called the pediment up here. This triangular area is the pediment. And then we've got the death of Priam on one side. And let me try to remember, what was the other one? Hercules and Apollo fighting in the other side. So we've got several different stories all wrapped up into this one pediment. And the size of these is always going to be a problem for the Greeks, because they have this triangular space that they need to fill, which means whatever's over here has got to be smaller. So the scale of the figures at these corners is a lot smaller than the Gorgon in the middle. We've got Medusa here in the middle. So there's neither congruence in scale or in story. It's like these random stories, and the scale's all different, because if the figures on the side stood up, they'd still be pretty small compared to the figures in the center. Well, here 50 years later in the Siphnian treasury, they've actually, in that pedimental, the pedimental sculpture is congruent in scale and in story. It's actually going to be showing the same story, and the figures here, instead of making them smaller in scale, they're just lying down. So they're just kind of in those corners, they're lying down, but if they were to stand up, they would be in the same scale as those in the center. So in 50 years, we're also seeing this change. So we have congruence of scale, congruence of story. Oh, better take a drink. If you'll notice, the Siphnian treasury also doesn't have columns that we would expect. These are called caryatids. We'll see them here, we'll see them at the Erechtheion, and we'll see them later in chapter 6. They'll be copied by Romans. But it's when a female is replacing a typical column. The Siphnians were really showing off their wealth. They have like one of the nicest treasuries. Do you guys remember the one? The Athenian treasury was kind of plain. This is like fancy. Oh, actually, here's part of the frieze. There was a couple friezes, and this is between Greeks and giants, but this one has got, we can actually see a lot of the layering to show depth in the frieze here. Oh, there's more. This looks like the Greeks and the Amazons. Okay. Now we're going to go on to vase painting. Okay. All right, so if you remember, Corinth invented the black figure technique, and the black figure technique we see here on the right-hand side, and that's basically when you've got the slip is being used here for the figures. Then when fired, the slip turns black. It's a black figure.
So the slip then isn't used where it's lighter?
Right. And so over here, like for example, the slip isn't used for these females' feet, arms, and face. It's been etched out. And so it's just the natural color of the clay that was used to make the amphora. I think this one's in your book, isn't it? Is the one on the left in your book? Yeah. Okay. So we have on the left-hand side, we have an amphora dating to around 540 by the Amasis painter, and it is Dionysus drinking wine. He's got his big Calyx Earth Wine. And he's got his Maenads, and they're kind of in their religious frenzy. And I think I've talked about Dionysus. We usually call him Dionysus, or in Rome, Bacchus, the god of wine. And I think I've explained it's not really the god of wine, it's the god of what wine does to you. So he uses wine to get you into that altered state of mind, but if you were in the presence of Dionysus, you wouldn't even have to drink. You'd just already be drunk or feeling that way. Dionysus is one of the, I think, like the only male in Greek art who is always clothed, because usually we see them, we see males nude, but we see here that he's very well dressed with intricately incised patterns on his clothing that were done. And then these women, which are usually shown with lighter skin anyway, their just outlines have been incised. So I'm not going to talk about this one. They're by the same painter, so I put them both up. But I want to talk about Ajax and Achilles, that they're playing a game, and this one's also in your book. This is by the Ezekias. Ezekias actually was potter and painter, and he's one of the great masters of the black figure painting, and he liked really serious scenes. And often there's a potter maker, because that's one craft, and then there's a painter. So a lot of these vessels will actually be signed by two people: the person who made the pot and the person who did the painting. So Ajax and Achilles, they're playing a game, and this is an event from the Trojan War. It was never written down, so you wouldn't have found it in any of the books, but it was something that the Greeks would have known happened. And these two friends are soon going to be parted by death. And they're wearing their full armor, as you can see, and they are two heroes and kind of important people in the Trojan War, and they're very into their game. And there's actually a little inscription that says, Ajax says, I have 3, and Achilles says, I have 4. But there's an incredible detail in the armor. I'm going to see if I can get up close a little bit, and your book's really wonderful too. You can see this wonderful incising and the details, probably better in your book than on here, that Ezekias was able to accomplish in this black figure, amphora. Now at the Nelson Atkins, we have an example of black figure vase painting, and it actually shows the scene that's kind of in between this. So the story goes, Ajax and Achilles, wonderful friends, are playing games. Achilles, as you know, dies at the very tail end of the Trojan War. And if you were given the armor of one of these heroes, someone who had died, that was a great honor. So it went to a vote. Who should the armor go to, Ajax or Odysseus? And at the Nelson Atkins, there's actually an amphora not painted by Ezekias, but painted by someone else, that is the voting. So all the different men that had been fighting together, all soldiers together, they vote who gets this armor. It's decided that Odysseus is going to get the armor, which is devastating for Ajax. It's kind of dishonorable. He feels like he deserved it, and he also feels shamed that his fellow soldiers didn't choose him. So he ends up committing suicide, and that's what we see on this side. This is also by Ezekias. Ezekias had a tendency to paint scenes with Ajax. He seemed to really like Ajax. We've got Ajax here, and now we've got Ajax over here, and he's about to impale himself right there, and that's what's actually happening. We kind of see over, because remember, the same painter did this. We've got this helmet kind of looking down over here. We've got the helmet looking down at him again over here. There's kind of these similarities even with these helmets. Ezekias, this is kind of the moment before the action, and normally we see this in the classical period, which we'll talk about, but Ezekias is showing kind of that moment before tragedy strikes. We know he's going to commit suicide. The Greeks would have all known that's what's about to happen, and we see him getting ready for it in this moment here. No, this is okay. So now, what the technology for this vase painting? They've been using this black figure technique, and then they think about it, and they're like, well, we could reverse this. We've been filling the figures in with slip and incising them to create it, but if we did the opposite, what if we filled the whole background in with slip, left the figures the color of the vase? It might look more realistic. Skin is more this color than it is this color. So they start doing the opposite. So we have black figure vase painting, and then we have what we call red figure vase painting. And so there's this period of overlap when the technology is changing from black figure vase painting to red figure vase painting. And we actually have some vessels that are called bilinguals, where one side is black figure and then the opposite side is in red figure. And this is a time where these artists kind of all know of each other. They even reference each other. Sometimes in their work there seemed to be a good-natured rivalry between these pioneers of the red figure technique. So I think your book has, does your book have this one? Something similar to this. So, so you kind of see how they address the exact same composition, the exact same figure, and they just do one in black and one in red. This is in your book, so I won't spend too long looking at this by Euphronius, but Euphronius was one of the pioneers, and he was working during this time, and this is one of his most famous vases. It was actually repatriated back to Italy in 2008, and it shows the death of Sarpedon, son of Zeus, and he fought with the Trojans, although he wasn't Trojan himself. He was from Anatolia in Turkey. He fought very bravely, but it was decided the fates that he had to die, and so even Zeus cannot fight against fate, and he's killed by Patroclus, and he falls to the ground. So there's a great detail here with the diluted slip in some of the areas where it's not quite as dark. I'm going to kind of zoom in so you can look at some of these details here. This is actually, it's basically quoting artistically quotes from the Iliad in book 16, and it talks about how he fell over like a tall pine tree, etc., and that's what it's quoting, that's what it's trying to show. Now, artistically, the artist is having trouble showing this body in a natural stance, and he's wanting to show as much of the body as possible to kind of show off what he can do with the human anatomy, but it isn't very naturalistic to us because it's very awkward. So the artist is going, okay, I really want to show as much body as possible to show them what I can do, and so he kind of puts poor Sarpedon in this kind of awkward position here, and then Zeus actually asks Apollo to take the body of Sarpedon and cleanse him and take it back to Anatolia where he's from. So that's the scene that we see is he's going to be taken back to his homeland, and Sarpedon will be taken back to Anatolia. Now, you can read about this in your book. I'm going to show you, we're going to look at one more, I think it's just one more tonight that we're going to get through. This is by Euthymides. So we've got Euphronius on the right-hand side and Euthymides. You don't have to worry about all these names. But these two, Euphronius and Euthymides, they knew of each other. They were working at the same time, basically the same pace. They probably were sharing technology, discussing it, and looking at each other's work. And we see that we've got, it's called the revelers, but it's basically like drunk people going home at night. That's what it kind of looks like. We've got these happy little dancing figures here and a very imaginative, complex poses. And it's written on it, and it actually writes, Euphronius could never have done this, and one figure's labored. So we've got Euthymides here referencing Euphronius, and the question is, what does it mean? Is he saying Euphronius could never have depicted human males in these interesting dance gestures? Or is it saying, I don't know, Euphronius could never have walked home drunk? Euphronius can't dance? What is he saying? Euphronius can't what? So Euphronius could not have done this. But this kind of shows that at this time, just that friendly rivalry, that they really do know of each other. They are talking back and forth. They're sharing technology, and it kind of brings, history seems so sometimes distant, but it kind of is like, it's funny to us that even back then they probably had a good sense of humor as they're working through this new technology. So the black figure technique dies out except for the vases that are going to be given to the victors at the Panathenaic Games, and those were just amphora with olive oil. And we're really going to see that the red figure is now predominant. Black figure is not going to be used. So we're going to go ahead and end here for tonight.